Over 100 million people, from more than 30 different countries. Between 1939 and 1945, our world literally tore itself apart, plunging into the absolute abyss of total war. Welcome to this explainer. I want you to step into the shoes of a historian with me today, as we examine the sheer, devastating scale of World War II. Now, we aren't just going to rehash battlefield tactics here. Instead, we are diving deep into the profound human tragedy and those massive geopolitical fractures that this conflict left behind.
Think of this as our syllabus for today's analysis. We're going to cover the deadliest human conflict, the origins of global aggression, a world engulfed, the turning tides of war, and finally, the aftermath and the Cold War. We'll trace the chronological events, sure, but we'll remain firmly anchored to the lasting consequences. Let's jump right in.
To truly understand this period, we have to begin with Section 1, the deadliest human conflict, grasping the scale of the tragedy. Because before we figure out how the war actually started, we really need to grasp what it ultimately meant for humanity.
70 to 85 million fatalities. It's almost impossible for the human brain to truly comprehend a number that massive, isn't it? But we have to try. This single, staggering statistic is exactly why, to this very day, World War II remains the absolute deadliest conflict in human history. We are talking about entirely wiped out communities, shattered families, and a global generation that was forever altered.
And here is what's absolutely crucial to understand. Those tens of millions of deaths, they weren't just soldiers falling on a battlefield. The reality is far more horrifying. We're looking at horrific, systematic civilian suffering. Millions perished in deliberate genocides, most notably the Holocaust. Countless others were victims of premeditated starvation, brutal massacres, and rampant disease. This tragedy wasn't just some accidental byproduct of war. In so many cases, it was the meticulously planned objective. Actually, the sheer scale of these targeted atrocities is directly what birthed modern international human rights laws, as the world desperately tried to guarantee that such profound horrors could never happen again.
Okay, moving on to Section 2, Origins of Global Aggression, the Inevitable Conflict. Let's explore the academic roots of this global tragedy. How did the world actually arrive at such a devastating breaking point?
You know, this conflict didn't just ignite overnight. It was a slow burn, heavily fueled by the aggressive, expansionist policies of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. But the foundation, that was laid years earlier by the incredibly harsh Treaty of Versailles right after World War I. Then, as we move into the 1930s, events like the Spanish Civil War and the Japanese invasion of China reveal the terrifying reality. The League of Nations was completely ineffective. Because it lacked any real military enforcement mechanism, aggressive future Axis powers realized they could carry out their imperialistic whims without facing any consequences. So by the time Hitler's armies invaded Poland in September 1939, a global conflict had essentially become inevitable.
And that localized aggression drew the global battle lines incredibly fast. See, Poland's sovereignty had been guaranteed by Britain and France. When their protests against Hitler's aggression fell on totally deaf ears, they formally declared war. So here's how the board was set. On one side, you had the Axis powers, primarily Germany, Italy, and Japan. On the opposing side, the Allied powers emerged. Initially, this was Britain, France, and the Commonwealth countries, but they were later joined by the immense might of the United States and the Soviet Union.
With the battle lines drawn, we enter Section 3. A world engulfed, the expansion of suffering. The sheer speed and aggressive expansion of the Axis forces in the early 1940s was unlike anything the world had ever seen, spreading suffering across multiple continents in a matter of months. Germany introduced a terrifyingly effective military strategy known as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. In the spring of 1940, this rapid, aggressive campaign led to the staggering, successive conquests of Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and eventually France by June. It was an overwhelming, shocking display of force. Following the sudden fall of France, there was a critical window of time where only Britain stood alone against the full, unchecked might of Germany.
Now, what's really fascinating about this slide is how the conflict rapidly fractured into entirely different chaotic theaters of war. Over in Europe, the Germans needed total air superiority to invade Britain, which led to the legendary Battle of Britain, where the numerically inferior British Royal Air Force actually managed to defeat the German Luftwaffe. Meanwhile, a new front opens up in Africa with intense clashes in Egypt and Libya. And perhaps most critically, the war exploded into the Pacific. Following the unprovoked attack on the U.S. Navy at Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, the United States officially entered the war right as Japan was rapidly conquering vast territories across Southeast Asia. But we really must bring our focus back to the civilian cost. Yes, the British RAF achieved a monumental military victory in the Battle of Britain, effectively shelving Germany's plans for a land invasion. But that didn't stop the terror from the skies. Relentless German bombing campaigns just continued, raining down immense devastation on British cities and towns for months. Even in the midst of a critical military victory, the urban destruction and civilian suffering were absolute.
By late 1942, the momentum finally started to shift, bringing us to Section 4, Turning Tides of War, the grueling path to victory. That initial lightning-fast expansion by the Axis powers ground to a halt, transitioning into a long, brutal phase where the Allies slowly and at great cost began to push back. It was a grueling timeline of reversal. Down in Africa, British troops secured a decisive victory at El Alamein in late 1942, trapping Axis armies and forcing their surrender. Over in the east, despite the Germans reaching the very site of Moscow, the Soviet Union fought back fiercely. They endured the absolute attritional nightmare of Stalingrad and eventually expelled the German forces completely by August 1944. And from the west, the Allies executed the monumental logistical miracle of D-Day, landing 1 million troops in Normandy by early July 1944. What you have here is a massive, devastating pincer movement. Allied troops pushing from the west, crossing the Rhine, while the Soviet army pushed relentlessly from the east, capturing Berlin. Realizing the war was completely lost, Hitler committed suicide, and by early May 1945, Nazi Germany officially surrendered.
But the surrender in Europe? It was not the end of the global nightmare. Let's transition to our final chapter, Section 5, Aftermath and the Cold War, the Lingering Shadow.
While Europe celebrated a fragile peace, fighting in Asia was still raging on. The planned Allied invasion of Japan faced the terrifying prospect of dogged, incredibly bloody resistance. So, Allied commanders looked for alternatives to a ground invasion. That alternative was the atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, a bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, followed by another on Nagasaki on August 9th. The massive, instantaneous casualties from these two devastating events finally prompted the Japanese government to surrender on August 14th. The war was officially over, but that exact moment forever introduced the terrifying threat of nuclear annihilation into the human consciousness. And as the dust settled, the absolute darkest chapter of this conflict was fully laid bare. I want you to look closely at this chart. Of the 9 million Jews living in Europe in 1939, a staggering 6 million perished. They were systematically murdered in concentration camps set up by the Nazis across Germany and occupied Poland. It is a loss of life, of potential, and of culture so profound that it remains one of the darkest stains on human history. When the fighting finally stopped, the physical map of the world was immediately redrawn, setting the stage for a totally new era of tension. The victors now stood face-to-face over a completely ruined continent. Allied troops occupied the western half of Europe, while the Soviet Union occupied eastern Germany and much of Eastern Europe. That alliance of convenience that had just defeated the Axis powers, it was already beginning to show deep, irreparable cracks. Which leaves us with this final, vital question to ponder. We look back at this incredible mobilization of humanity, the sheer sacrifice of up to 85 million lives to defeat tyranny. But look at the aftermath. Did the end of the deadliest war in history actually bring true peace? Or did that fragile alliance simply fracture the moment the common enemy was gone, immediately drawing the tense nuclear-armed battle lines for the Cold War? The shadow of World War II stretches incredibly long, and its consequences are still woven into the geopolitical fabric of our world today. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. I really encourage you to keep questioning and keep exploring history.